The clerk shoved the iron bolt and stepped back. He did not expect a man to look up from a wooden bench as the cell door eased open. The sight halted him by the doorway, a living man in a damp cell who should have been moved years before. Doubt tightened the clerk's jaw. The ledger should have shown a transfer. Within moments the central problem was visible and urgent. The records did not match the room before them. Jacob Merrick sat with his hands folded over his knees. He lifted his chin without hurry and studied the clerk as if assessing whether to speak. The clerk swallowed and called, "Warden Korst. There's someone here," the word cut down the corridor. Jacob listened and returned to tracing the bench grain with his fingertips. The discovery was immediate, concrete. A man, a bench, a sealed cell now opened. The question followed fast. How had the roll never been corrected? The warden arrived with a deliberate step. Emil Korst's spectacles caught lamplight as he leaned into the doorway. He glanced at Jacob, then at the clerk, then toward the ledger under his arm. "Name?" he asked. His voice suggested routine, not shock. The clerk read aloud a name from a scrap of faded ink. "Jacob Merrick," he said. The ledger on the warden's lap opened to a page of dates and signatures. Emil's finger tracked down columns and stopped on a blank where a transfer stamp should have been. Within the first minutes, the chapter's leading feeling had formed and would shape what followed. Doubt. The clerk doubted the ledger. Warden Emil doubted the accuracy of the day's entries. Jacob seemed to doubt nothing. His actions were small and precise. That doubt made people move differently. The clerk drove his nails into the wood of the desk. Emil rubbed the bridge of his nose and flipped pages faster. Jacob did not demand answers. He smoothed the torn hem of his shawl and began to count again, tapping his fingers once, twice, 3 times, then humming a short tune under his breath. He counted the taps aloud when the guard was near. The sound measured the day. Jacob's routine was a quiet refusal to let the ledger decide his sense of time. The clerk watched him and felt unease shift toward responsibility. They carried the ledger back toward the office. In the dim corridor, the clerk kept glancing at Jacob, as if the man might slip away and alter the record a second time. "How long?" the clerk started, then stopped. Emil shut the cell door with a quiet click. He set the ledger on his knee and said, "Bring the ledgers." "All of them." His voice moved from practical to brisk. The ledger search would show whether this was a clerical oversight or something worse. At the table, piles of thick paper leaned like small, dusty walls. The clerk, whose name was Thomas, pulled ledgers down and opened them to stamped pages. He thumbed through ragged folios while Emil examined names and seal impressions. They spoke aloud the dates they found and the names that matched. Their dialogue came in short lines. "Here, transfer slip missing. Thomas, missing where?" "Emil, between 89 and 90. There's a gap where Merrick would be." Thomas tapped the margin. Emil's jaw set. Then the transfer was never recorded. Or it was misfiled. He leaned closer and traced a faded signature with an ink-stained finger. "Look at this margin note. Smudged. Probably a rushed entry long ago." Thomas lifted a thin slip from a chest of smaller papers and held it up like evidence. "This belonged with some ledger. But it's been loose for years." The slip had an official stamp half, impressed, and a date in a hand that shook. The detail suggested not theft but neglect, a document detached, mislaid, and then buried. Jacob returned to his cell while Thomas carried the slip with him. The guard walked him through the corridor and left him at the threshold. Jacob closed his eyes for a fraction and then set his fingers to the bench again. The physical actions, tracing the wood, straightening a frayed boot remnant, were his way of staying present. Each tiny motion held him to the day. When Thomas came back to the office, he kept glancing over his shoulder, as if the bench might change by the next look. The discovery shifted from a mystery of misplacement to a pattern of small losses. In the archive alcove, under a dust layer, Thomas dug until his sleeve blurred with dirt. He found a ledger with a torn corner and a faded stamp. A transfer slip lay half, buried between pages, its ink faded but readable. The clerk's excitement moved into alarm. "This is not a single error. Thomas Emil, pages have been moved, notes crossed out, signatures half, obliterated. Someone has been shuffling paper for years." His voice rose a notch. Emil read the slip. and let his eyes rest on the script. He touched the old signature and paused. Hands change, he said slowly. Guard to guard, office to office, people retire. Paper stays messy. It isn't a hand that erased a man so much as a system that permitted lapses. His manner carried an attempt to quiet panic with explanation. That created an emotional shift in the room. Thomas's alarm turned to frustration. He demanded to know why no one had noticed earlier. We keep a running account. Emil replied, mistakes happen. We correct them. We cannot make every past clerk's oversight a scandal now. His words tried to confine responsibility within institutional practice. Thomas leaned forward. Jacob Marek should not still be here, he said. If he was transferred, someone failed. The word failed landed as accusation. Jacob heard the exchange through the wall. He did not raise his voice. Instead, he gathered his shawl and wound it around his shoulders. He tested the weight of his stopped pocket watch and set it on the bench. The watch face was frozen at 9:20. He pressed the rim and listened to nothing but the room. His hands trembled once, then settled. He had spent years shaping himself to small certainties. The knock at mealtimes, the scrape of a bowl, the sound of rain on a narrow window. Those certainties preserved his sense of self when official records did not. Thomas returned to the archive with the slip in hand and began arranging pages in chronological order. He muttered dates and names aloud as he worked. 1823, signed by Havel. 1824, blank. 1825, transfer stamp missing. He paused at a torn margin. Someone moved this ledger. The pages aren't in order, his voice sharpened. The room filled with the scent of dust and old ink. The physicality of paper gave the discovery weight. Emil set his spectacles on the table and massaged his temples. He admitted an uneasy fact. The ledger sequence showed not a single error, but a chain of omissions that stretched back years. We will log a correction. Emil, we will note Marek and schedule a transfer. Thomas wanted names and signatures, someone to be accountable now, not later. Thomas, now. The tone rose toward confrontation. Emil did not match Thomas's rising urgency with equal force. He turned pages and spoke in measured lines. Thomas, the institution cannot be torn apart for every missing stamp. We must be careful. We will mark it. We will proceed. Calmly, his words were chosen to steady the clerk and the ledger, not to accelerate action. That decision produced a second emotion shift. From Thomas's anger to resignation as Emil's pragmatism settled the room. Jacob watched the doorway as the warden considered what to do. He watched without pleading. When Emil stepped into the corridor, Jacob caught the softened light on the warden's coat. He watched the warden's hands, which fidgeted with a quill. Jacob had a habit of noting small movements. He measured time by them. His acceptance was not defeat. It was a practical adaptation born of years alone. The clerk pressed again, Warden Emil, with respect. If we file only a note, no one will move him. We owe him a proper transfer, or at least a record that places him. If we do not, he stays forgotten. The clerk's voice lacked theatricality. It held a tight urgency that made Emil pause. Jacob Marek is a living man, Warden. Thomas, he deserves a name in your rolls that matches a body in a cell. The phrasing forced the issue into simple terms. Paper must match life. Emil folded the ledger closed and set it aside. He spoke in a lower tone now. Thomas, watch the ledgers for the week. Make a notation. I will appoint an assistant to process the transfer when the next routine convoy is ready. Thomas's mouth tightened. He demanded immediate action. Warden, will you sign a transfer today? Thomas. Emil looked at Jacob's silhouette in the doorway and then at Thomas. A convoy moves on schedule, the warden replied. To call one in for a single man would disrupt the prison and invite questions. We must balance order against this mistake. Emil set his hand on the ledger and tapped a margin. I will make a note and schedule it. That must suffice for now. The choice was concrete. A notation in ink instead of the motion of a transport. The clerk's anger constricted into disbelief. So a man stays here while we await a convoy. We mark him and pretend that is action. Emil met the clerk's stare and answered directly, we do not pretend. We manage the institution. Marking allows proper paperwork to follow. Immediate action without process risks further confusion. The exchange pushed both men into clearer positions. Thomas accused. Emil defended the system. The confrontation produced tension that climbed to the chapter's planned peak. Jacob watched as the conversation ended. He rose and moved toward the bench. He picked up his stopped pocket watch and cradled it. He nothing aloud, but his hands tightened on the metal and his throat moved. The physical reaction was audible in the room. Thomas leaned forward and asked, "Mixed Merrick, did you expect to be moved?" Jacob's reply was a quiet line. "I counted on nothing more than the next sound," he said. His answers were spare. The clerk stared at him and then looked to Emil. A minor twist arrived when Thomas opened a smaller drawer and found a marginal note in a different hand. The note bore a single line, "Awaiting transfer, see convoy list." The line was dated decades earlier. Thomas read it aloud and then faltered. "This was noted once," he said, "then the convoy list never included him." Who removed his name from the list? The new detail reframed the mystery. It implied someone had handled the process and then let it stop. Emil's face changed slightly. He rubbed at an ink stain on his finger and said, "Hands changed. Papers are shuffled. It is not always a single act of neglect. It is a series of small ones." His choice of words tried to spread responsibility across time. Thomas pushed back. "Small ones still add up to a life forgotten," he replied. His voice sharpened, and the exchange turned from technical to moral. The tension crested into the chapter's climax when Thomas demanded immediate, visible correction and Emil chose delay. There were 3 quick lines of argument that followed, each short and forceful. "Warden, sign now." "Thomas, I cannot pull a convoy for one case," Emil answered. "Then make a public notation and move him by hand. Show that we do not let records disappear." "Thomas," Emil hesitated for a bare breath. He put one hand on the ledger and the other on the quill. "We will note it and schedule." "That is the course I will take," he said. Jacob watched the exchange without interrupting. His breathing shifted once, shallow and measured. Thomas's anger gave way to a tight acceptance. The decision was a small, official motion, penciled note and a promise. Thomas left the ledger open on the table and set the half-buried transfer slip on top. He did not file it away. He walked to the cell corridor and looked down at Jacob. They exchanged a few words. "Jacob, I will watch." "Thomas." Jacob nodded. "I will mark the bench every morning," he replied. The line was simple and pragmatic. Both men agreed on small acts intended to count for more than the warden's note. Night closed on the stone corridor. Jacob returned to his bench and set the stopped pocket watch beside him. He pressed the rim with his thumb and recalled the cadence of a meal bell from 20 years before. 3 slow rings, a pause, 2 quick rings. He hummed that pattern and tapped his fingers to it. The habit anchored him in a present that the ledger had failed to secure. The final paragraphs of the chapter tied to a concrete event. Emil filed a penciled correction. Thomas placed the recovered transfer slip on the ledger for safekeeping, and Jacob, left in his cell, ran his thumb along the bench grain and set his watch face down on the wooden seat. The clerk closed the office shutters and walked out into the courtyard with the slip folded in his coat. Emil returned to the ledger and underlined the name. He did not march to the convoy office. He did not call an immediate transfer. He traced a faint signature and set the quill aside. The chapter ended on a small, concrete scene. The warden sealing his ledger with a notation, the clerk walking away with evidence in his coat, and Jacob settling beneath his shawl with the stopped watch in his palm. Those are the actions that close the chapter. The official correction had been made in ink and pencil, yet action had been postponed. The night sealed the corridor as it always did. A life remained listed and present at once, recorded in a margin and still waiting for movement. The final sound was the click of the cell bolt and the soft scrape of wood as Jacob settled to count once more. The ledger lay open on the table, and the clerk stopped with his finger on a blank column where a transfer ought to be recorded. Doubt tightened the clerk's jaw as he tapped the empty space. His hand did not shake. His eyes did. The ledger smelled of dust and dried ink. The first concrete problem sat above the page. A name that ought to have moved through the system and had not. Warden Emil Corse watched without moving. He kept his thumb hooked on a corner of the leather, bound book and let the clerk lift the lamp a little higher. Korst's face was practiced in small indifference. He preferred clean lists and predictable rounds. That evening, the ledger disrupted his routine. "Show me again," a Korst. His voice was steady. He turned the page with the slow care of a man who handled brittle things daily. The clerk pushed the lamp closer and read aloud, "Jacob Merrick, transfer column empty, no exit stamp, no arrival stamp." No notation. He looked at Korst and added, "It should be here." His fingers tapped the margin twice, quick and brittle. Korst grunted and rubbed his temple with an ink-stained thumb. He made a face that contained an apology and a shrug at once. His immediate reaction was procedural. Keep counts, maintain rolls, do not let one discrepancy slow the machine. Doubt had arrived in the room, and it shifted toward the ledger and then to the cell block beyond the doorway. The clerk's next sentence carried the new tension outward. "We opened cell 3. There's a man inside. He isn't on the transfer list." He lifted his chin and met Korst's eyes. Korst's jaw tightened. "Cell 3, I signed transfers last month. Who found him?" His words were practical, not sharp. He reached for his spectacles and peered at the page again. The clerk answered. The bolt was shoved from the outside and the cell opened. He sat on a bench and looked up. "He should have left years ago." The clerk's voice cracked on the last phrase, and he swallowed. That crack altered the room's economy. The ledger was no longer merely ink and numbers. Korst folded his hands over the ledger and chose deflection. "Record him as present. Keep the daily counts. We'll sort the paperwork later." He closed the book halfway with the weight of habit. The clerk did not accept the half closure. "Warden, the transfer column is blank. There's no order. The name is missing a stamp." "This is not later." He set the lamp down like a small accusation. Korst leaned back. He looked at the clerk, at the lamp, at the ledger. "Mistakes happen. Papers are lost. Make a note and move on. People are counted every morning." His voice told of a man who had solved many small problems by not enlarging them. They walked back through the corridor under low light. The walls pressed in with damp plaster. Their boots sounded on stone. Each step carried the ledger's silence. At the cell door, the clerk hesitated. He remembered the opening scene from earlier that day. A different man had shoved the bolt, the cell door had given, and a living man had lifted his head from a wooden bench. That memory from the morning, metal, wood, a face looking up, was concrete and urgent. Jacob Merrick sat in his habitual posture. He traced the grain of the bench with the pad of his index finger, motion that no one had named for decades. He wore a threadbare shawl over rough linen. His hands were thin, and his gaze measured the wood as though it recorded time for him. The clerk spoke first. "Jacob Merrick," he said slowly so the name landed. "Why were you not moved?" He placed the ledger against the cell's threshold to keep the name present. Jacob's voice was small and steady. "I was here," he said. He did not ask for release. He described, plainly, the rituals he had kept. The clocking of meals by the keeper's shout, the scraping of a bowl on Tuesdays, the rain that made the stones smell of iron. His sentences were short and precise. The day the bolt had been pushed and the clerk interrupted with a question. "Did anyone ever come with papers?" The clerk asked. Jacob looked down at his hands. He tapped an old rhythm with his fingertips. "A page once came with a stamp," he said. It was folded and damp. I kept it under the bench." He pointed to a dark crease at the board's edge. The clerk crouched and reached under the bench. His fingertips brushed cloth, then paper. He brought up a single folded ledger page, soaked at the corner and yellowed around a faint seal. The stamp was smudged, but a round impression remained. The clerk's tone shifted from curiosity to accusation in a single breath. "There is a stamp. Someone ordered a transfer and it was never done." He stood and faced Korst. "Warden, there is a paper. There was an order." The sentence struck like a struck key. Now the empty column had a cause. Korst's hands fell to the ledger again. He opened the book and found nothing conclusive. He ran a finger along the margin as if tactile proof might appear. His manner changed. The previously steady shell cracked into caution. A moment after the paper surfaced, a knock came down the corridor. Measured official, steps followed. The clerk looked at the door. "Who could come now?" he asked. The knock became a presence in the corridor, and then a figure appeared. A magistrate's inspector in a dark coat with dated forms tied by string. He carried the air of someone who moved between offices and reads stamps with care. He introduced himself and unfurled papers on the table with slow hands. "Inspector Voss," he said, and he lifted a form toward Korst. "I carry the county's return. There is a cancelled transfer here." He tapped a corner where a seal had once been pressed and now showed only a faint wet ring. Korst read the forms and his face tightened. The clerk leaned close and read aloud the crossed lines. The transfer had been cancelled at a regional office 3 years earlier. A faint official stamp matched the smudge in Jacob's pocket. The papers changed the ledger silence into evidence. Korst looked at the inspector and then at the clerk. He shifted from deflection to defense in the space of 3 breaths. "The transfer was cancelled," he said. "Who cancelled it?" He pinched the bridge of his nose and his voice thinned. "The record shows the order was returned with a cancellation note. Inspector Voss, the seal is faint, but present." The county returned the form stamped. He looked at Korst as if asking how a returned form had not been acted upon. The clerk's voice rose in controlled impatience. "So someone authorized the erasure. Someone above returned the order and we received nothing." He tapped the table. Jacob sat waiting. His next line was a demand. Why did no one follow through? Korst's hands moved faster now. He turned pages and looked for marginal notes, initial marks, anything that would reveal who had received or neglected the order. He frowned. "There are gaps," he said, "pages torn, entries smudged. The keeper who handled transfers retired last year," he added. "Records pass hands and sometimes they fray. We keep the daily counts. We do what we can." His voice tried to rebuild the wall of institutional care. The inspector examined the folded page found in the cell. He rubbed the seal with a gloved thumb and said, "This was a formal direction. It was marked cancelled here. Someone at the county returned it. The signature is partial but present." His statement shifted the question again. Who in the chain had allowed the cancellation to mean nothing to the man it named? Emotions moved across the room by small motions. The clerk pressed his mouth and looked at Korst. Korst's jaw set. Jacob watched the movement of the papers and kept his fingers on the bench. He did not beg. He listened. Korst made a choice that felt small and large all at once. He closed the ledger and said, "I will make a marginal note. I will write Jacob's name in the side column with the date and the inspector's presence. Then we will continue our counts in the morning." His words tried to convert responsibility into a small, manageable act. The clerk spat softly. "That is not enough, Warden. You will write his name in the margin. You will not transport him. You will let him stay. Paper will remain paper." "I will not let a man remain because of a margin." He leaned forward and lowered his voice. "Do you remember opening the cell this morning? You stepped back and the man looked up. You saw him, Warden. You signed off on transfers that day elsewhere. Did you sign his away?" Korst's face tightened. "I signed many lines. I do not recall every single mark." He inhaled and then spoke in a lower, quieter register. "Mistakes happen. We correct them when we can. Tell me what you want me to do now." His words were precise, measured. The clerk responded quickly. "List him for transfer now. Note the inspector's file. Send a messenger to the county archives for the missing pages. Place him under watch so he does not vanish back into a forgotten corner. Record his possessions and the page found here. Tell the keeper to produce the book of exits." He named concrete steps. Each instruction forced Korst away from neat minimizations. Jacob listened and then spoke with a voice that carried the steady, resigned cadence of someone who had learned how to ask for nothing grand. "I do not want a parade, Warden. I want to be seen in the roll. I want my name on a line that moves me somewhere else. A note will not carry me out of the gate." He tapped the bench and looked at Korst. "My measure is the meals. When they call, I go. When they do not call, I wait. I have counted days by the scrape of bowls. I have not counted men in papers. Put me on a line that moves me." His request was literal, constrained to what he could understand and use. Korst's hand hovered over the ink and quill. He hesitated, a pause that showed his practical mind working. The inspector watched him. The clerk watched him. Outside the cell, a distant cuff on stone told of the evening watch changing. The world continued to make small, indifferent noises. The inspector cleared his throat. If the ward makes a note only in the margin, the county may accept that nothing needs doing. If the county stamped the transfer cancelled, it signals closure to higher offices. Someone must authorize a new movement. The county must issue a new order. His tone placed responsibility squarely on institutional processes rather than on any single person in the room. Korst's shoulders dropped a fraction. He wrote slowly into the margin. Jacob Marek, noted present, found with return transfer, inspector present. He dated it. The quill scraped. The letters were tidy. His handwriting did not tremble. The clerk read the marginal line aloud. Jacob Marek, noted present, found with return transfer, inspector present. When he finished, his voice held an edge. Write that you will request a new transfer. Note you will send a messenger at first light. He pressed his palm flat on the ledger as if to push the words into paper. Korst added a short line. Request new transfer at first light. He set the quill down. He did not commit to a timetable beyond the phrase itself. Outside the record's alcove, the watch changed. Voices moved in the corridor. The inspector folded his papers and said he would file a copy at the county office. He tapped the faint seal. I will note on my report that an order existed and was returned. I will request reissue. He did not, and could not in the moment, promise immediate action. Jacob sat and traced the bench grain. He listened to the ledger close. His breathing matched the scraping of the quill as the warden sealed the marginal note with a small flourish. He did not smile. He nodded once, the tiniest motion, acceptance folded into habit. The clerk did not leave the room in quiet. Korst, he said sharply, write the keeper's name in the register and have him deliver Jacob's bundle to the gate. I will stand at the gate tomorrow to see the line called. Do not let him slip into the count again as a mere presence. He named what he would do and where he would be. Korst agreed, but his agreement came with a caveat. I will ask the keeper. I cannot promise beyond the count. The county completes the documents. There was an exchange of practical promises, not vows. That night, Jacob returned to his small rituals with a new, brittle awareness. He slept in a shawl that had kept its threadbare edge for years. He woke to the sound of keys and to a cook's low whistle. He trimmed the corner of the damp page and kept the stamp between his fingers for an hour. He practiced the sound of his own name by whispering it once when the Garda's shadow passed. Jacob Marek, he repeated it like a small test to see whether the name still belonged to him. Outside, the ledger's marginal ink darkened in the night. The clerk walked the corridor with a lamp and checked the doors. The keeper where to find the folded page in the cell. He wrote a note and sealed it for the messenger to the county archives. A new task now lived in his hands. The inspector left with his bundle and a quiet motion that conveyed a promise he could not fully guarantee. Korst locked the ledger and placed it on a shelf among other books, but he put a ribbon in the page to mark the margin he had written. That small ribbon was a physical intervention. It ensured the page opened back to Jacob's name faster than a random search would. Minutes later, Korst stood in the doorway and watched Jacob trace the bench. He did not call the man by any new title. He did not offer words that would remake the man. He only said, "We will note the order. We will send a request." His voice was plain. Jacob nodded. He kept his fingers on the wood. He did not ask for the county seal. He asked to be moved from absence to presence on paper. That immediate, concrete want framed the chapter's outcome. A small cliffhanger opened before the chapter's end. At dusk, a messenger arrived breathless and carrying a sealed packet from the county archives. The keeper took it but did not open it in the corridor. The packet its seal matched the faint impression on the damp page, and the clerk watched as the keeper paused with the packet above his palm. The scene stopped there with the packet unopened, a hinge that promised new reading in the next chapter. The ledger had been a place of omission. The marginal note had been a partial remedy. The inspector's stamp had been an admission from above. The undone transfer was now a named, recorded wrong rather than a nameless slip. The chapter closed with Korst's hand on the ledger and with Jacob continuing to count meals. His name written in a margin that might carry him out only if the county issued a new form. The warden wrote in the margin, and the clerk stood at the gate until morning. But the final motion belonged to the county archives and the sealed packet waiting to be opened. The inspector's cane struck the iron gate, and he demanded to see the transfer ledger immediately. Doubt tightened Emil Korst's face. He rubbed his temple and gestured for the clerk to fetch the book. The inspector did not speak politely. Bring the ledger now, Korst. The demand left no room for delay. Emil's first reaction was a small, impatient instinct to smooth the situation with explanation. He opened his mouth, then closed it. The clerk had his hand on the ledger already. The clerk said, "Warden, the ledger is here." But the inspector cut him off with a short nod and the word, "Open it." The scene moved from the gate to the antechamber within a measured breath. Within 5 sentences the conflict was visible. A sudden audit, an uneasy warden, and an inspector expected precise records. The central problem had form and weight. The ledger might show a transfer that never completed. That possibility pushed the chapter forward. That doubt guided Emil's choices as much as any law. The narrator noted the doubt aloud in small, factual phrases. The inspector's boots scuffed the floor as he walked to the table. He pushed a chair back and bent over the pages. Emil stood with his hands folded, the brass of his spectacles catching the lamplight. The clerk opened to the most recent entries. The clerk's finger paused over an empty column. There is a blank here where a transfer should be recorded." The inspector's eyes narrowed. He whispered, "Who last signed the transfer?" Emil answered too quickly. "I signed several this month. Papers move in bundles. A slip may have been misplaced." His voice held a thin defensiveness, a warden's reflex to preserve order. The inspector read the names aloud. Jacob Marek appears in an earlier note, but no onward mark." The clerk tapped the page. The inspector repeated, "Jacob Marek." The name landed in the room like a pebble in still water. Guards in the corner shifted their feet. The narrator kept description spare and direct, and allowed tension to rise by the exchange of facts. Emil's second emotion, when the ledger failed him, was embarrassment. He shifted his weight and drew one palm down the front of his coat. The inspector watched him. The inspector asked, "When was he transferred in the records?" "Emil, 3 years ago on a set of slips." The clerk interrupted. "There is no completed transfer stamp." "The line is empty." Emil's hands went to the ledger as if to find a missing signature between pages. A search began immediately. Emil ordered trunks and cupboards opened. He searched the storage. "Look through trunks and account bundles. Every chest." The inspector's voice was short and precise. Guards moved toward the records room. The clerk rose with a candle. The narrator recorded the sequence as actions: a command, a movement, a search. A guard found a folded note in a spine while rifling through a bundle of old accounts. "Sir, there's a slip here, tucked into the spine." The guard held the paper out by one corner. The handwriting was faded. The clerk took it and read, "Jacob Marek, transfer to Lesserford House," stamped but unsigned. The paper changed the atmosphere immediately. Doubt shifted toward something more concrete, proof that a paper existed and had been put aside. The inspector leaned forward. "Bring him out." "I want to see the man listed," Emil called. "Guards, fetch Marek from cell 12. The men moved at Emil's direction. Jacob Marek came forward with a stopped pocket watch in one hand and a tattered scrap of cloth in the other. He moved slowly and kept his eyes lowered. Jacob's first appearance in the daylight of the corridor held small, concrete details that mattered. His shawl hung in patches, his boots were frayed, and dust marked the hem of his sleeve. He held the pocket watch to his chest. Nothing until the inspector addressed him. The inspector said, "Jacob Marek." Jacob answered, "I am Jacob Marek." His voice was thin, steady, and measured. He did not demand anything. He did not plead. He offered the watch and the scrap of cloth as proof of his counted days. The inspector took the watch and turned it in his fingers. Dialogue continued in short bursts. The clerk asked, "Jacob, how long have you been in that cell?" "Jacob, I do not know the year. I count by meals and the rain." I know weeks by the sound of the guard's boots, the inspector said. Show me the watch. Jacob handed the watch across, and the inspector held it near the lamp. The watch face was stopped. The glass had a crack at the rim. The inspector said, It stopped long ago. Jacob touched the watch's edge with a finger and said, I set it each morning by memory. That concrete detail made his time measurable. Emil tried to explain himself. We keep many slips. A clerk misfiled one. It was never logged onward, the inspector answered. Misfiled is a weak phrase when a man's transfer was not completed. Emil's voice tightened. The inspector's tone introduced a new pressure, accountability. Emil's shame deepened into a wary attempt to explain the processes that allowed an error. The ledger was carried under the inspector's scrutiny back into the records room. Guards followed with Jacob and the clerk. The narrator kept the scenes focused on action. The search continued in trunks and in a sealed chest that Emil had kept for older receipts. The inspector ordered the chest opened. Emil hesitated for a single breath and then reached for the iron key. The inspector said, Open it, Emil. Emil handed the key and the clerk eased the lid. Papers slid and rustled. The clerk's hand moved through stacks until it hit a folded packet. He drew it out and set it on the table. What the clerk unfolded was a stack of stamped receipts and notices. One showed Jacob Marek's name in a hand the clerk recognized, the same looping script used for transfer slips. The inspector stated, these were stamped. They were recorded but never forwarded. The room made small audible breaths. Emotion shifted again. From embarrassment into a sharp clarity that stung the warden, Emil put his face in both hands for a moment. I remember signing a packet that included Marek. A clerk must have set these aside with accounts and forgotten them in a rush. The inspector looked at him. Who last handled the bundle, Emil, I cannot say. The night bundles are handed between clerks. We rely on the seal and the ledger. The inspector's next move would push the scene to its peak. The inspector turned the papers over carefully. He read a stamped mark, then said, There is a county stamp here. The slip bears a note. Transfer filed with a date. The clerk's voice rose a notch. The date is 18 months after Marek was listed here. How did these sit unrecorded? The inspector's tone hardened into a demand for truth. A rapid exchange followed. The inspector asked, Emil, did you notice these were missing when you examined transfers? Emil answered, No. I relied on the ledger and on the clerk's seals, the inspector said, coursed. Reliance is not an answer when a man stays in a cell for years. Emil's face went pale. I did not know. That sentence had no flourish. It was a warden's statement that admitted ignorance. A sudden, smaller twist arrived when one of the guards found another folded slip behind a bundle of unrelated accounts. The guard said, Here, another one, sir. The clerk took it and read aloud, received at Lesserford House. Signature missing, the inspector said. A signature missing does not erase the paper. But it does suggest omission rather than malice. Doubt in the room changed shape. It now pointed to negligence, not to deliberate cruelty. The inspector assembled the documents on the table and laid them beside the ledger. Bring me witnesses who handled these bundles. Emil pointed to the clerk and said, Start with Johan. He packed accounts last month. Johan, a clerk in his 30s, was summoned into the room. He stood by the door, hands folded. The inspector questioned Johan directly. The inspector asked, Johan, did you place these in the storage chests? Johan, I did. I packed a batch, and I recall setting a bundle aside for later counting. The inspector pressed. Why set it aside? Johan answered, There were missing stamps on some items. I meant to return and check them, but I was pulled to a different set of accounts. Johan's voice revealed a small, practical shame. A brief argument flared between Emil and Johan. Emil, you should have returned them sooner, Johan answered. You gave me further orders that night, Emil. I acted on them, the inspector intervened. Enough. The facts will stand where they fall. The argument contained quick, human lines and 3 to 5 rapid exchanges as required. Names were used to track speakers. The exchange exposed how the misfile happened, a chain of small omissions. Jacob stood near the table as men spoke his administrative fate like a set of invoices. He did not raise his voice. He touched the edge of his shawl and sighed once. The inspector looked at him and asked, "Jacob, were you made aware of any transfer in writing?" "Jacob, only a folded page I found once in my cell." "I thought a guard left it by mistake," the clerk said. "A folded paper in the cell would fit the pattern of misfiled slips." That recollection changed the meaning of an earlier discovery from Chapter 1. The clerk has surprise at seeing Jacob in a cell when a transfer should have moved him. The inspector paused and then ordered, "Seal these documents and note their serials." "We will issue a corrected transfer now." He looked at Emil and said, "Sign here." Warden coursed. Emil hesitated. His hands shook when he took the pen. He signed a line he should have signed years earlier. The action was small and concrete. Emotion shifted again toward a cramped relief as the machinery of paperwork moved to mend a human oversight. Jacob watched Emil write. His jaw tightened. Nothing. The inspector arranged the papers and began to write fresh orders. He read the names aloud as he wrote. Jacob Merrick. Transfer to Lesserford House. Dispatch guards today. The clerk repeated. Dispatch guards today. Guards readied chains and a ledger to note times. The room moved into practical motions that would conclude this chapter's conflict. Before the transfer could proceed, the inspector asked one more question. "Warden, why were these documents left in a chest rather than entered in the ledger?" Emil answered, "We had a backlog of accounts. A clerk set aside items to be checked. They never returned to them." The inspector said. "That detail means the neglect was procedural, not targeted." The inspector's voice declared the moral shape of the oversight. Jacob finally spoke to Emil directly. "Emil, why did no one knock on my door?" Emil looked at Jacob and felt the force of plain speech. "Jacob, I cannot say why the steps were missed. I can sign now." Jacob's reply was a small acceptance rather than a triumph. He held the stopped watch and put it in his pocket. The inspector called for the clerk to record the corrected entries. The clerk took the pen and set the date. He wrote in neat, careful letters. Guards prepared to move Jacob. Before they did, the clerk folded one of the stamped slips and handed it to Jacob. The clerk said, "Here, this belonged to you. Keep it as proof." Jacob took the folded slip with both hands. He smoothed the paper like someone treating a fragile map. The episode closed with measured gestures. Emil signed the belated transfer order. The inspector filled in the proper stamps and seals. Guards led Jacob back toward the cell doorway only to detain him briefly, a procedural stop while the inspector arranged transport. The clerk closed the ledger with a slow, deliberate motion. The final scene of the chapter did not offer a grand moral pronouncement. It ended in a concrete act. Emil placed the final seal on the papers. The inspector said, "We will ensure transfer today. Make a record of this review and deliver copies to the county office." Emil nodded. The clerk stamped the ledger and slid the copy into a drawer. Jacob folded the slip and tucked it into his shawl. Outside the records room, one guard said, "We leave at dusk." Another answered, "We will go after evening meal." Jacob listened to the schedule and counted mentally. He stood straighter for a moment and then resumed the small rate of his breath. The chapter's immediate conflict, whether Jacob's disappearance from records was deliberate or accidental, resolved into proof of misfiled slips and administrative neglect. Two things had shifted in the course of the morning. Doubt had become clarity. Embarrassment had become apology through a signature. The inspector's arrival turned routine orders into a corrective action. The misfiled papers that the chest revealed were the specific cause. The people who handled them confirmed procedural failure rather than cruelty. Near the closing, Johann approached Jacob and said, "Jacob, I am sorry." Johan's voice was low but direct. Jacob answered, "I accept the paper." "Thank you." The exchange contained no flourish. It registered human acknowledgement in a single gesture and two short lines. The clerk watched them and then returned to his seat. The narrator closed on a concrete, situational beat. Emil handed a sealed envelope to the inspector that contained the corrected records. The inspector took it and said, "We will coordinate departure." The inspector left the room with the envelope under his arm. A guard closed the records room door and locked it behind him. That lock closed the chapter's immediate action and set the stage for the next movement in the story. Throughout the chapter, the narrator avoided sweeping metaphors and stayed to the tactile facts. A cane striking iron, a finger on an empty ledger column, the sound of paper rustling in a chest, the stopped face of a pocket watch. The story's emotional root, doubt about how a man could be forgotten, appeared in the earliest sentences and guided choices. The emotions shifted from doubt to embarrassment to a terse, pragmatic remedy, all shown through dialogue, short gestures, and administrative movements. By the chapter's end, listeners could recall at least 3 names: Jacob Marek, Warden Emil Korst, and the clerk Joan, and link each to a specific behavior. Jacob's patient measurement of days, Emil's bureaucratic defensiveness, Johan's hurried misplacement. The inspector's arrival forced action and exposed the chain of small errors. The sealed chest revealed the misfiled slips, the belated signature was the concrete remedy. The chapter closed with Emil handing over the sealed envelope and the guard locking the records room door. The inspector's stamped paper struck the iron gate, and a sharp doubt moved through the courtyard. Suspicion tightened Emil Korst's jaw as the inspector read the heading aloud and set the page on the sill. "Where is the transfer for Jacob Marek?" the inspector asked, his cane tapping the stone. The question landed on the warden like a weight, and the clerk beside him swallowed. This was the moment the administration could be shown careless or corrupt. Doubt would determine the next steps. They had reached this moment by small, stubborn facts. The clerk had opened a cell earlier, and a living man had looked up from a wooden bench where no man should have been. The ledger on the table had shown a blank column where a transfer ought to be recorded. The inspector's cane had struck the gate once before, louder then, and that sound had brought men running. Emil had watched those earlier actions with a practiced face. Now that same face tightened. Emil stepped forward and tried to arrange his expression into calm. "Inspector, the ledger," he began. "Bring the ledger now." "Korst," the inspector answered. Emil motioned to the clerk. The clerk moved like a man with pages in his head but not sure where they belonged. They walked to the records room with urgency in their steps. A thin shaft of late morning sun fell through the high window and caught dust on the air. The clerk flipped brittle pages. The inspector's gloved hand hovered over columns and dates. "Look here," the clerk said, tapping a blank column with his ink. "Stained finger, blank," the inspector repeated. "No transfer, no note." What happened on the date this should show? Emil rubbed his temples, the gesture mechanical and sleepy at once. The search widened. Boxes were tipped, trunks lifted, and a damp smell rose from a trunk in the corner where water had once pooled. A folded transfer ticket, water, stained and half legible, slipped free and fluttered onto the table. Jacob Marek's name appeared along a torn edge in faded ink. A new sound came then, the clerk's breath sharp and unsure. "Jacob Marek," the clerk said aloud, and the name did not carry any accusation, only the fact. The inspector closed his hand over the ticket and walked toward the cell wing. Jacob stood at the end of his narrow corridor when the clerk came for him. He rose from his bench with a steady, careful movement, the way a man used to moving in small spaces would rise. The inspector laid the damp ticket beside the open ledger and pointed. "Explain this to me, Warden Korst," he said. Emil's practiced detachment shifted. His mouth pressed thin. Jacob did not protest. He folded his hands and kept his eyes lowered. The inspector's gaze moved between the damp ticket and the ledger lines. "This paper says he was transferred years ago," the inspector said, "yet he sits here. Why is that column empty?" Emil's voice came tight. "I do not know the reason, Inspector. I only keep these rolls. The clerk keeps the day-to-day entries." The inspector did not accept the sentence as an answer. A tension grew in the corridor that was not loud but concrete. Shoes shifting, the scrape of chair legs, the clerk's fingers worrying at a page corner. The inspector demanded a full accounting. Emil's hands hovered over the ledger as if the book had the answer. The first emotion that drove Emil's choices was suspicion that someone had failed to do a duty, suspicion that records had been mishandled. That suspicion sent him to a cupboard he kept for quick fixes. A small trunk with staff notes, correspondence, and occasional transfer tickets folded for speed. They found a cramped marginal note tucked in a different volume. A blot of old water had smeared several lines. Staff names were crossed and new ones written in different inks. The note showed a chaotic transfer after a flood and several rapid reassignments. The clerk read aloud in a thin voice, "Flood in the autumn of the 3rd year. Transfers delayed. Staff changes. Entry lost." The inspector's eyes narrowed. The note shifted the scene from accusation toward an institutional failure. Emil exhaled and his shoulders slumped a fraction. The doubt in his chest altered into unease. Jacob listened without shifting his hands. He counted the beats of footsteps as the inspector paced. He checked the seam of his shawl with a fingertip, that small ritual he used to keep time. "So the ledger is damaged," the inspector said. "Records were messy after the flood. Why was that not fixed when new men arrived?" Emil met the inspector's gaze. For a moment the warden's eyes flashed. The emotion shifted again in him from unease to a sharper worry. That worry was practical. It asked what to do next to make the paperwork reflect reality. The inspector spoke faster now. "A man should not fall between pages," he said. "A man should not be left to rot where no paper points to him." Who signed this that it went unattended? The question was not rhetorical. It demanded names. Emil looked at the clerk. "You handle daily entries." "Emil, I do." The clerk answered, fingers still ink smudged. "Then tell me when Jacob Marek was last noted. Tell me who changed. Tell me what you did after the flood." The inspector's voice held a hard edge. The clerk turned pages quickly and his voice rose small but steady. His eyes flicked to Emil when he spoke. "There were 3 men on duty when the flood came," the clerk said. "I wrote what I could, but the water smudged the ink. Then Master Bogan left and another took his place. I assumed the transfer slips went with the trunks." "Assumed," the inspector repeated. "Assumptions do not file reports." Emil felt the heat of the inspector's accusation and answered more quickly than intended. "We were overwhelmed. The racks were wet. I sent men to repair the shelves. I ordered the clerks to cross-reference. The slips were there. They went missing later." The conversation tightened into an argument of small facts and names. The inspector pressed for the names of the clerks who handled the slips. Emil named 2 men and a date. The clerk named the same date and added a name that had not been expected. "Raymond left 2 years ago," the clerk said. "He took the trunk to the East Registry. No one kept a strict watch." The inspector's expression hardened into suspicion again, but now the suspicion focused on system failure and human turnover rather than a deliberate cover-up. An external change arrived. A messenger from the East Registry arrived out of breath and handed a folded paper to the inspector. The paper contained a short note. Several files in the East Registry had been misplaced during a staff reorganization 3 years prior. The messenger's face was young and apologetic. "We found a trunk mislabeled," the messenger said. "We kept it, but we did not open it until now." The inspector read the note and sat back. The arrival changed the direction of inquiry. The clerk opened the mislabeled trunk under the inspector's steady eye. Inside, amid damp plated straw and a rodent-chewed bonnet, lay a small, folded slip with Jacob Marek's name written across the edge. The ink had run and the paper was soft with age. The inspector set the slip beside the ledger and said, "This paper says he was transferred. This slip says he left." Yet he was not moved. Emil felt his throat tighten. He had done what he could to keep order. He had not expected a man to be left in a cell while paperwork drifted. Jacob's voice was quiet when he spoke for the first time since they had called him. "I remember the sound of rain the night the water came," he said. His voice held no accusation, it held a sequence. A night, the sound, men moving, a slip folded into a trunk. He named concrete details: water at the sill, the smell of wet straw in the corridor, the rat that chewed a bonnet. The inspector listened and then asked, "Jacob, did anyone come back for you?" Jacob looked at Emil and then at the clerk. "They came, sir." Men moved fast. "I waited for the bell to call the transfer. The bell did not come. I waited another day and then another. A small, crucial reveal shifted everyone's understanding. Jacob described the bell that was supposed to mark transfers. The bell had been rung in the confusion. but the man who had carried the slips had been assigned elsewhere the next morning. Jacob named the man Raymond. The inspector repeated the name and leaned forward. Raymond is gone, but his trunk remained. The slip was folded away. No one checked the corners where papers hide. The room grew quieter and a new movement rose in the inspector's face. Not only suspicion but demand for accounting. Emil felt a colder, steadier feeling now. Responsibility. The warden's choice arrived on the table with the inspector's demand. He could file a report that would expose the administration's failures, name staff by negligence, and invite inquiry. Or he could quietly correct the books, move Jacob, and keep the institution's shame from public view. Emil closed his hand on the ledger and let silence sit between his fingers and the inspector's stare. His hesitation showed in the way his thumb rubbed the spine of the book. The inspector's voice sharpened, coursed. He said, "This is not about shame or pride. This is about a man who was left where no paper points to him. I will file my own notation if you do not do so." Emil's breath came short. He thought of the prison's reputation, the men who relied on its steadiness, the municipal board that watched budgets more keenly than faces. He thought of a past staff change named in the marginal note and of the clerk who had worked by lamplight for years. The warden's worry became a practical calculus. Expose the failure and risk closure and reprisals, or repair the ledger and move on. The clerk interrupted with a small, sharp voice. "Warden Emil, the ledger does not repair the years Jacob lost," he said. His words were not a plea for cover but a statement of fact. The clerk's tone moved the room. It forced everyone to consider what a correction could and could not do. The inspector's jaw tightened and then he nodded once. "We will record what we find," he said. Emil looked at the inspector and then at Jacob. He felt the weight of the choice press along his shoulders. The inspector insisted on a public notation and a formal transfer order. Emil's face moved through doubt, then shame, then a small, determined motion. He took a pen quill, smoothed the ledger page with his palm, and wrote a line that would stand. Date, name, and the new notation that Jacob Merrick was to be transferred to the infirmary for assessment and care until a fuller report could be lodged. The action was small and decisive. A pen on paper, a name entered where a blank had been. The clerk watched Emil's hand and set an ink pot down with a soft clink. Outside, the corridor held the small noise of men prepared for orders. Emil signed and then looked up. "Clerk, see that the transfer is carried out. Inspector, note the marginal entry and include the flood report. We will open an internal review." The inspector's answer was crisp. He would forward a stamped notation to the central office. The clerk moved to fetch a stretcher and a lanthorn. Jacob folded his shawl around his shoulders with practiced care. As they guided Jacob toward the infirmary, small sounds marked the movement. The scrape of boots, the wheeze of the corridor lamp, the creak of the infirmary door. Emil walked beside the stretcher with the ledger under his arm like a heavy, honest thing. Jacob traced the rim of his stopped pocket watch with 2 fingers and did not look up. He kept to his counting, to the rhythms that had helped him survive. The inspector followed behind and spoke once to Emil in a lower voice. "I will write an account that shows the chain of failure. Names will be noted. This will not be concealed." Emil nodded. Inside the infirmary, they laid Jacob on a narrow wooden bench and put fresh straw beneath him. A steady-faced infirmary man checked his pulse and asked him a practical list of questions. When did the last meal come? How long had he slept on the bench? Did he have any wounds? Jacob answered in short, measured phrases. The infirmary man, the nights he had marked the passage of time by tapping his fingertips against the bench. The man noted his answers and began to prepare a bowl of warm broth. Later, in the warden's office, Emil sat with the clerk and the inspector over the ledger and the marginal note. The inspector wrote sentences that would be read by officials in the morning. He described a trunk mislabeled, a slip misplaced, and the failure of staff handover after the flood. He listed names. Raymond Masterbogan, the clerk on duty. Emil coursed as warden. Emil read the lines and felt the gradation of feelings move through him. First suspicion, then unease, then responsibility, then a reluctant sense of rectification. He did not try to soften the wording when the inspector asked for accuracy. A new discovery appeared in the trunk later that afternoon. Beneath damp straw, a scrap of cloth with an embroidered initial that matched a name in an older receipt. The clerk recognized the stitchwork as belonging to a family who had once petitioned for Jacob to receive milder custody years ago. This small reveal altered the shape of the report. It added a human thread. Someone had tried to place Jacob elsewhere, but the paperwork failed to follow. The inspector made a note of it and folded the scrap into his copy of the report. The clerk, who had kept records for years under lamplight, spoke quietly across the table. "Warden Emil, I have seen how records get lost when men leave without handing over trunks. I have corrected what I can now. I will add footnotes where we have gaps." Emil listened to the clerk and then said, "Do it. Make it clear where the blanks were and what we found." He pushed the pen across the desk to the man, and the clerk took it. The choice to repair records was both practical and symbolic. It placed an honest line where a blank had been. Jacob sat in the infirmary later that evening, and the world moved around him in small, steady actions. A bowl of broth steamed at his lips. The infirmary man tightened a blanket around his shoulders. The pocket watch lay on the bench with its hands frozen. Jacob turned the watch over in his palm and pressed a thumb to the glass where the minute hand stopped. He did not speak of years. He listed small marks of time: morning when the bell called for bread, the night rain on the roof, the scraping of shoes in the corridor. His calmness came from counting and from naming things he could still place in order. The inspector filed his notation that night and sent stamped copies to the central office. He wrote the facts plainly: a misplaced transfer slip, staff turnover, a flood that smeared ink, and a man who remained in a cell while the pages showed nothing. He concluded with a recommendation for an internal review and for a public notation of the event. His language did not seek to punish. It sought to record and to require an answer. Emil read the inspector's final paragraph and felt the last of his defense thin out. He had chosen to correct the ledger and to order Jacob's transfer to the infirmary. Now he would accept the administrative consequence. A final complication unspooled just before dusk. A distant relative of Jacob's sent a short note to the inspector through a municipal clerk. The note arrived folded and said simply that a woman named Marta Marek, Jacob's sister by the same surname, had petitioned for transfer requests the year the flood occurred and had been told to wait for paperwork. The note said she had not been informed later when staff changed. The inspector read the note and set it alongside the marginal note from the trunk. The two together clarified a fuller chain of small failures. A petition, a flood, mislabeling, staff turnover, misplaced trunks. Emil stood then and walked to the infirmary with the inspector on his heels. They found Jacob leaning on his elbows and tracing the watch rim. The infirmary man had stepped out but left the lamp burning. Emil spoke quietly. "Jacob, I will sign the transfer and order care. I will open a review so this does not happen again." Jacob looked at Emil and blinked slowly. "Thank you, Jacob." The words were plain and not pleading. Emil's voice was low when he answered, "It is the least we can do now." The warden's choice reached its peak when Emil returned to his desk and dipped the quill. He wrote the formal entry. Date: Jacob Marek's name, the circumstances found, and the directive to transfer him to the infirmary and to place a formal incident note in the central files. The pen scratched against the page, and the clerk watched the line fill in where a blank had been for years. This was the chapter's moral peak, a decision to acknowledge failure publicly rather than to tuck it away. After the ink dried, Emil folded the ink, washed slip into the ledger and told the clerk to file copies with the stamped reports the inspector had prepared. The clerk moved with careful hands. He made a neat notation where the margin had been torn, and then set the ledger shut with a steady thud. Outside, the infirmary light glowed through the window. Inside, Jacob held his pocket watch and turned it over once more. That night, the ledger bore a new line and a new signature. The inspector left with copies to send to the central office, and with an instruction that a fuller review be scheduled. The clerk stayed late to cross, check ledgers, and to list names of men who had been on duty during the flood. Emil did not sleep that night. He walked the corridors and checked doors. He paused at Jacob's infirmary door and watched the man breathe in slow, even rhythm. Jacob sat awake in a clean bed until the lamp burned low. He traced old stitch marks on the scrap of cloth found in the trunk and said softly the night he had kept counting. He did not ask for restitution. He named what he missed in practical terms. The sound of a street vendor's cart, the way rain hit a wooden awning, the call for soup in the courtyard. Those were the facts he kept to keep himself real. By morning, small administrative changes had been set in motion. The clerk sent a formal list of corrective entries to the inspector. The inspector stamped his copies and packed them for the courier to town. The warden wrote his own note, admitting the gap in records and promising a full accounting. Jacob ate warm bread and watched the ledger arrive in the infirmary when the clerk brought it to show him the new line. He traced the handwriting of Emil's signature with one fingertip. The letters were heavy and deliberate. The final moves were practical and unromantic. A transfer order, a note to the municipal board, a schedule for the internal review, and a set of names placed on a watch list for future handovers. Emil oversaw each action with slow care. He met the clerk's eyes and by a small nod conveyed that the work must be thorough. The inspector left with a clean stack of stamped papers and a last instruction that the municipal record mention the flood and the lost slips. Jacob packed a small parcel of the few items he owned, a tattered scrap of cloth, the stopped pocket watch, and the frayed remnant of a leather boot. He put them into a small bundle and tucked it under his shawl. The act was deliberate, each object connected to a clear memory. The night rain, the bench he slept on, the bell that did not ring. The clerk helped him stand and they walked slowly to the transfer corridor. Emil brought up the rear with the ledger in hand. At the infirmary door, Emil stopped and addressed Jacob plainly. "Jacob Marek," he said, "and let the syllables rest. We will note what we found. We will begin the review tomorrow. You will have a chance to tell your facts to the inspectors." Jacob nodded once. He folded his hands and looked at Emil with a steady gaze. "I will tell what happened when I can recall it in order, Jacob. I will tell when you ask me a fact and I will answer." Emil inclined his head and then reached for the ledger to add a short marginal note. "Inmate present despite prior transfer notice. Internal review ordered." The pen made a thin black line and the page took it. They closed the infirmary door behind them and the corridor felt slightly different. A small lightness because the ledger no longer had a blank column where a name should have been. Jacob sat on the infirmary bench and turned the stopped watch between his fingers. He placed it on the bench in front of him and pressed his thumb to the cold glass. Outside, the inspector had already written the first sentences of his report. The clerk had catalogued boxes to be sorted and labeled. Emil stayed at his desk until late, listing names and dates and the points where noise had drowned the ink. The chapter's final note was simple and concrete. Emil signed the transfer order, set the folded slip in the ledger, and rang the infirmary bell to indicate Jacob's arrival. The bell sounded once. The sound was neither triumphant nor apologetic. It was a small administrative sound that signaled a fact. A man had been moved and the books now showed it. Jacob watched the bell and then, with a precise motion, traced the rim of the stopped watch once more. The ledger gained a neat line and a life moved into a quieter order. Outside, the municipal courier carried stamped copies into town. The inspector prepared to write his fuller account. The clerk began to reorganize files under the lamp. In the infirmary, Jacob set his watch on the straw beside him and lay back with his hands folded. He counted the breath in and the breath out. He named the next meal in his head and the time the sun would cut through the window. He held to those rhythms and, by doing so, held a place for himself in a world that had briefly misplaced his name. Emil walked back through the courtyard and paused under the lamp. He thought in concrete terms of the tasks he must complete. A list for the review, the names to call, the ledger passages to cross-reference. He made himself a schedule on a scrap of paper and tucked it into his coat. His decision had been made by weighing consequences. His action had been to place an honest line in the book. That line could not restore 40 years, but it could prevent a blank from remaining. Jacob slept that night with the infirmary lamp low and the pocket watch at his side. He did not speak of years. He slept with a timetable in his head, bred at dawn, the infirmary man's rounds, the sound of a courier's foot on the stairs. When the morning came, Emil would be waiting with a fresh pen, and the clerk would have the first list for the review. The inspector's reports would be on their way to the central office. The ledger, once closed, carried the record of the day. Ordered transfer, marginal note, names to be questioned, and a formal notary of institutional failure corrected by immediate action. Jacob turned the stopwatch over in his palm and set it beside him. He counted one last time, then closed his eyes. The lamp burned on above a new, small order.